The government hates your mitochondria and the window industry hates your mitochondria. And the more they make the windows and the light bulbs environmentally friendly, the more they have the exact wrong spectrum for your mitochondrial needs. If you have an energy efficient window, then you have to open it because energy efficient windows hate your mitochondria. It blocks out all the good stuff, yeah.
Chris Masterjohn, PhD, is a nutrition scientist and expert in micronutrients, metabolism, and mitochondrial health. His work explains why energy systems fail, why supplements stop working, and how to prevent health plateaus by fixing the foundations first. Are there specific types of exercise, whether it be like high intensity interval training maybe for mitophagy? Is that a thing?
We should think about exercise for the brain in the same way that we think about exercise for the muscle. If you are practicing healthy emotional responses to your environment, you are enhancing the mitochondrial function in the brain networks that are responsible for that outcome. The most effective treatment that anyone has ever developed for depression is the placebo effect. If you look at drug trials, the average efficacy of an SSRI, for example, is 54%. The average efficacy of the placebo in those trials is 40%, which means that 75% of the treatment effect of the SSRI is placebo effect.
Well, I'm so excited today on the podcast to have Chris Masterjohn, PhD. He is a nutrition scientist, educator, and independent researcher known for translating complex biochemistry and nutritional science into practical, actionable guidance. He holds a PhD in nutritional sciences and is widely recognized for his work on micronutrients, metabolic pathways, and individualized nutrition. He also has taught biochemistry and nutrition at the graduate level and is the founder of Mastering Nutrition, where he educates clinicians and consumers on how to optimize health through nutrient sufficiency, metabolic context, and system-level thinking. And you're the founder of MitoMe, right? Am I saying it right?
Mitome.
Mito. Oh, yep. Just Mito. That's all.
Mitome, and the website is mito.me. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure. I have a Mito test up there, which I'm super excited to take. But I was trying to give myself a little bit of time. So I've had a ton of international travel lately, lots of speaking, probably 8 different countries. So I don't even know if it matters, but I figured let myself be back home for a few weeks and maybe it can normalize. Is there any rationale to that or not really?
I think the best time to test is definitely when you've been stable on the regimen that you believe is the best for you. And so I think most of us find that traveling a lot is correlated with stressful situations, but there's, the airplane itself is stressful on the body and things like that. So I do think that under ideal circumstances, having been pretty stable for 4 weeks on whatever your regimen is the best thing to do. Some people can't do that because they're always moving around. Mm-hmm. But that does relate to a lot of questions that we get in general about what are a lot of people think do I need to go off all my supplements and do I need to do this and that? And I think a lot of confusion is generated about that because people think that they can get to some kind of pure baseline, but the pure baseline doesn't exist. If you're 38 years old, you have 38 years plus 9 months of history. You've got your genetics, you've got everything that your mother did when she was pregnant with you, you've got everything that happened to you over those 38 years, and you've got many thousands of trends that are operating on different time horizons. So you can't generate a pure baseline. And I think the answer I like to give is you do a test because you're trying to get new information that you didn't have before that's going to allow you to do even better than you were doing before. So if you are on a multivitamin, for example, that should be because you believe the multivitamin is helping you get to where you are. Yeah. And if you took it out, you'd be less healthy. So you want to be stable on whatever you think is the right thing for you to do. Yeah. Then you get new, better information that gets you to the next step. And that's the right time to test.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, a lot of tests, let's say a gut test or something that you're taking, it'll say don't take probiotics or this or that. So I understand why people might think that, but for me, I've always operated on if something's part of my baseline, like I'm always going to be on an omega-3, I'm always going to be on magnesium and probably some form or amount of vitamin D. So for me, that feels like a baseline. So I might as well just stay on it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that.
So I will say, though, it was kind of crazy. I had on Aura Ring, I had a negative 11.5 cardiovascular age prior to this like stint of travel. Drop basically throughout the travel, it rose back up to -6. And now just being home the last 2 weeks and doing my regular routine, it's going back to -7.5. But I was shocked. Like,
Interesting.
and I don't travel. Like I still order all my food. It's all organic. I still work out. I still go to bed at 8 o'clock, even if the time difference is different. So I was shocked by how much travel can negatively impact you.
Yeah.
So, and I'm sure it's making a big impact on our mitochondria that we're going to talk about a lot today.
Oh,
So
for sure.
let's like go to the very beginning. I mean, mitochondria, I feel like, is incredibly popular. Everybody's talking about optimizing their mitochondria, but first, what are mitochondria really doing? And then what does deficient or maybe suboptimal mitochondria look like?
Well, the saying that everyone knows since elementary school is mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. Some people like to broaden that out in their discussion to say, well, mitochondria don't just produce energy, they do all these other things. But I think that the way that I would broaden it out is kind of in the opposite direction. So I think the fundamental thing that mitochondria are doing are producing your cellular energy. And everything else that you think about your health is all about your cellular energy, even though you think it's about something else.
Yeah.
So people think, people are seeing the surface level of what's happening. Like, why is my hair falling out? Or why is my skin wrinkling? Or why do my wounds not heal as fast? Or why are my periods too painful? Or why can't I get pregnant? Or why can't I gain muscle? But all those things come down to the fact that everything that you have in your body was produced using the cellular energy that your mitochondria make. And then once those things are produced, maintaining them, repairing them is all fueled by cellular energy. And then the top level of, if you think of it as a hierarchy of needs, if you've produced what you need and you've been able to maintain it and repair it, then what do you do next with the energy that's left over? You distribute it into its proper place. And so a lot of problems that we think of as, like, let's say someone's thinking about anxiety, or someone's thinking about why are my muscles tremoring or something like that. That's ultimately energy that you do have that's being funneled into all the wrong places, right? So you have cognitive and mental energy, but you're putting it into worrying instead of into being productive or calming down and being restful. Or you have muscular energy, but instead of being strong, you could have tremors and also be relatively weak. And those are examples of having some energy, but distributing it in all the wrong ways. And ultimately that comes down to whether your mitochondria are producing enough total energy to invest the cream of the crop, the top layer of that energy, into how everything is distributed properly in the body. And we could take any health problem and we could talk at any level, high level conceptually, or we could talk about the molecular causes of it, but we'll always be able to come down and explain the exact connections with how is dysregulating the flow of the cellular energy driving that, or how it's just not having enough total energy driving that.
So if I have this correct, so let's say, your goal is to build muscle, but you're not, or gain strength. So we have kind of like the bank of total energy that's produced by the mitochondria based on how healthy they are. And then obviously the mitochondria are probably going to triage the most important things first, right? Like keeping you alive. So if you don't have the amount of mitochondrial energy that you're meant to have, you might not be getting, benefit. You might be seeing health deficits essentially because you don't have the total amount of energy. It's just going to keep you alive, basically. Is that kind of
Yeah,
right?
no, that's exactly correct. And if you were to kind of double click on the muscle building part, you can try to force your way into building the muscle, but you will notice your health suffering as a result of that. So for example, maybe someone's doing 40 sets to failure per week and they're not gaining muscle, so they push it to 60 or 70, at some point they're going to start suffering in their health just because their fundamental problem is that their recovery capacity is built on whether their mitochondria can produce an abundance of energy to fuel both the workout, to fuel all their basic health needs, to fuel their ability to fulfill all their other daily obligations, and then have enough left over to actually add pounds of muscle like that person wants. But if they're failing to build it and they're already not feeling well recovered and they try to force it, they may even actually force some muscle growth, but it might come at a much more dramatic cost to their quality of life, their health, their ability to not get sick and other things. Or they might just not be able to do it at all, and they might only experience health comes from trying to push so hard on it. So I think if you feel like your recovery capacity is limiting your ability to push yourself harder, then that's a good reason to think that there are strategies that you are missing that you would be able to apply in order to boost your mitochondria's ability to produce that abundance of energy.
Interesting. Yeah, so the mitochondria eventually will like kind of triage to, okay, the muscle really needs attention now, but then it's going to probably neglect something else.
Yeah.
Got it. What percentage of people do you think have healthy mitochondria these days?
Well, I see a lot of results from the tests that we do, and I would say 10 to 20% of people who come in have really nice looking mitochondria, where, the result might be, your mitochondria look great, congratulations, but here are some things that you can work on. And I think, the rest of us, but it's, what are you comparing it to, right? Because you do expect that if everyone's mitochondria were functioning perfectly and you had the most abundant production of energy imaginable, none of us would be getting gray hairs. None of us would be, not sleeping enough at night. None of us would be wondering how we could feel more energetic in the day. None of us, we wouldn't have any health problems. And so I think what that reflects is that everyone is in some sort of deficit relative to what their potential is. And so everyone would benefit from trying to figure out exactly what are the actionable strategies unique to them to try to meet their maximal potential.
Yeah. As it relates to your test, would you say that the majority of individuals getting your test are already probably a healthier population, or are they actually really unhealthy and having mitochondrial issues and trying to sort it out?
It's mixed. I mean, there's definitely a correlation with the ones that look the worst are usually coming from people who got the test because they had a health problem they were trying to solve. But we definitely have, people who are optimizers and they just want to optimize everything.
Yeah, that would be like why I'm taking the test, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I think I don't always know why the customer bought the test, but in terms of the ones that we talk to or who give us feedback, that's where I'm drawing my conclusions from right now. And I would say that generally the people who are heavy on the optimization front without any problems, they're the people that are usually getting results that say, congratulations, there's nothing wrong with your mitochondria. But, this pattern indicates that if you were to try to bring your health to the next level, we could say you should be doing these 3 things.
Yeah. What are there a few patterns that you can share? Like I am so interested to learn, what does a healthy mitochondria express itself in this data set?
Sure. So one large kind of category would be some people do not have enough mitochondria and some people have too many mitochondria. And what you see is those are 2 sides of the same coin. On the one hand, you want a lot of mitochondria, but you want mitochondria that work well, and you want mitochondria that are doing their job sufficiently that there isn't this constant stimulus telling your body that, we don't have enough energy, let's try to make more mitochondria. So in general, when the test is coming back showing an overabundance of mitochondria way outside the normal range, it's a signal that the person is being driven by compensatory actions for the mitochondria not doing their job. And then on the other hand, there are people who they just don't have the signal for mitochondrial biogenesis operating properly. Mitochondrial biogenesis means it's a fancy word meaning to make more mitochondria. And they wind up with not enough. And I think those are situations where people would want to do very different things because there are a bunch of supplements that you could take to stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis. There are fasting feeding strategies that you would put different emphasis on depending on which of those problems you had. And then, of course, exercise is a major driver of where you get your mitochondrial biogenesis signal, which is important for everyone. So that's one category of problems. And then we also look at the detailed signatures of the mitochondrial respiratory chain, which is the engines that power mitochondrial cellular energy production. And so you can think of this as like your engine's got 4 cylinders in your car. Well, your mitochondria have 4 major energetic cylinders that we call complexes, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can look at those and see, what your primary nutritional needs might be, B, whether you're a candidate for using something like methylene blue or CoQ10, or whether, if you're using CoQ10, are you more a candidate for the run-of-the-mill kind of sweet spot of 100 to 200 milligrams that we see having the max benefit in the average person in clinical trials, or are you someone who's got a major deficit where you might be looking at 700-800 milligrams might benefit you, and various things like that. And so these different complexes have different nutritional cofactors, and they have different flow patterns for macronutrients. So some of those might indicate that someone would be better off on a high carbohydrate diet. Others might indicate that the person might be better off on a high fat diet. So looking at those different patterns can allow us to make inferences about what would be the unique to you strategy to implement based on your mitochondria's limiting bottlenecks.
I love that. When you say that it might be, an indicator of your diet choices, would that be a permanent diet choice, or like your mitochondria in general prefer more carbohydrates, or would it be like right now your mitochondria need more carbohydrates?
It's definitely contextual on the underlying cause, and often there are multiple potential interpretations of that. So what our protocols do is walk the person through how to empirically test that for themselves.
Okay.
And in general, you want to try, mitochondrial bottlenecks are a lot like traffic jams. And if the main highway is the best way to get home or best way to get to work, the ideal solution is to not have any traffic on the main highway. But the secondary solution is to form a detour. You can pick a different route that's not as clogged. So what we want to try to do is fix the problem first. And for example, let's say that someone has a bottleneck in fat metabolism that is driven by not having enough riboflavin, which is vitamin B2. It's one of the B vitamins. If what you'd want to try to do is optimize the riboflavin first, because that will enable the fat metabolism. But if that doesn't work, that's when I think that's the right time to step in with the macronutrient change. And so the way that we structure the protocols that we give people is to give guidance on a step-by-step implementation and to give things in a sequence where the person can test themselves, trying to fix the bottleneck first, then seeing if they need to work around it. And the ultimate test to which one is working is the results that you get in your health. And then sometimes people, their results, they have 3 or 4 different problems. And so we might, let's say they went on a low carbohydrate diet towards the beginning, we'll have them revisit that and see if they still need it, or if the the totality of the solutions they've gotten will allow them to tolerate the carbohydrates better at the end.
Got it. If we were to think about the levers, let's say that you could pull for optimal mitochondria, it obviously sounds like micronutrients is a huge one. So I do a test again 4 times per year called the micronutrient test by Vibrant. I've also done the micronutrient test by Genova. And my goal is always to be in the optimal level. And it's looking at serum and cellular levels of these nutrients. And we can talk about if you think that's like a valid test or not. But
Sure.
I mean, I obviously, it's helpful because I know I can either make some amendments to my nutrition or I can make some amendments to my supplementation. But let's say, obviously, that's a huge one. Like, how would you rank and what would you rank? Would we rank micronutrient status first for mitochondrial health, or is it something like red light therapy, exercise?
I think it depends whether we're talking about the idiosyncratic stuff or the general principles. But I guess we should talk about the general principles first, because everyone should be doing what everyone should be doing before they should be trying to figure out what they should be doing themselves. That's different.
Yeah.
And so I think if I were to pick 5 top strategies for mitochondrial health that everyone should be following, I would list them as micronutrients, as you just said, and the mitochondria depend on all the nutrients. So I could highlight that there are special places for vitamin B2, vitamin B5, iron, sulfur. But if you biological complexity is like an onion. If you just peel back one layer, you've got the next layer, you peel that back. You don't have to peel back too many layers to see why every single nutrient is important to mitochondrial health.
Yeah.
And so I do think that what you're saying, just don't be deficient in anything, is a very important rule. And there are dietary strategies for that, but I think having a testing-based approach offers more precision and allows you to clean up a lot of the blind spots that you might have about that. So I like that. And then I would say exercise and going through a healthy fasting feeding cycle are 2 very complementary ones, but that's number 2 and 3.
May I ask a question
ahead.
about the exercise? So obviously exercise is a big there's many things that can be within that. Are there specific types of exercise, whether it be like high intensity interval training, maybe for, I don't know, mitophagy? Is that a thing? What sorts of exercise and how frequently in an optimal world?
Yeah, I think it's easy to be misled on this topic because you can do a study that shows that a particular type of exercise enhances, say, skeletal muscle mitochondria on a biopsy, but then you're going to miss the point that another type of exercise wouldn't have enhanced the skeletal muscle mitochondria as much, but it would have enhanced the liver's mitochondria a lot. And I think that you're going to see intensity play a role in that, because in endurance, for example, the slow twitch muscle fiber mitochondria are very important to the fueling of that endurance exercise. But at high intensity, you're going to see the fast twitch fibers being more important, and the liver is going to step up to help them a lot. Because, for example, you're doing very short bouts of high intensity, the muscle is metabolizing glucose to lactate. That lactate is then going through the blood, going to the liver, and then the liver is stepping up with its mitochondria to help use that lactate for the purpose of the exercise. So the way that I like to think about it is to acknowledge that, number one, mitochondria energy production is driving every important health outcome. And so you have to reason with the actual real health outcomes you see from the various types of exercise. And my opinion is you want all of it. And I also think that we should think about exercise for the brain in the same way that we think about exercise for the muscle. Yeah. If you are practicing healthy emotional responses to your environment, you are enhancing the mitochondrial function in the brain networks that are responsible for that outcome. And if we're just talking about physical exercise, I really like to point to this study that came out earlier this year showing that gymnasts and pole vaulters have 8 years of longevity over the general population. And if you look at people with great body composition, which we know is a driver of longevity, and cardiorespiratory fitness, which we know is a driver of longevity, they're still getting 6 years on those people, like cyclists and runners, for example. And I think what that reflects is that the great diversity of functional movement quality that demands all of the different joint and muscle functions is actually the best way to holistically fight off all the different causes of aging and death.
Yeah.
And so what I take from that is everything in your life is going to follow a use it or lose it principle. You're going to grow or you're going to die. And you don't want to leave anything out of your exercise program. Now that seems a little overwhelming because how am I possibly going to do all of it? But you have to look at how much time you have in your budget, but you have to try to do some endurance and you have to try to do some high intensity. You have to do some strength and you have to make that strength move in all of the planes of movement. So it can't just be moving like this. You got to be able to move like this laterally. You got to be able to do rotational exercises. Elite athletes can pay attention to they can break down, 5 different zones of intensity. I think for the average person, you don't need to think that hard about it. I think that you just need to have some exercise where your primary goal is to keep it moving for time. And you have to have some other exercise where your primary goal is to be huffing and puffing as fast as you can to break a sweat and to have your heart beating through your chest, even if it's only for 30 seconds. Yeah. And then you have to have some exercise that's geared towards strength. But then I think you need to exercise everything else that you don't want to lose. So you need to exercise your memory and you need to exercise your creative thinking. You need to exercise your problem solving. You need to exercise your emotional stability. And all of those things are going to enhance the mitochondria in the specific networks responsible for those outcomes. So the reason that I said it was complementary with the fasting feeding reset or the fasting feeding cycle is because when you fast and you feed, you get this systemic signal for fasting tells you need more mitochondria and feeding allows you to make them. But that's like a whole body signal. Exercise then accentuates where that signal is supposed to go, right? Okay. So going through a proper fasting feeding cycle will help you get more mitochondria, but exercising your brain is going to put them in your brain. And exercising your endurance is going to put them in your slow twitch muscle fibers. And exercising your high intensity is going to put them in your faster muscle fibers in your liver. And that's why you need to do all the exercise. So
yeah. I love that. I mean, my protocol, I'm thinking about every area. So cardiovascular training, which includes zone 2, and then, VO2 max training. Then we also have strength training, 4 or 5 times a week, stability, mobility, stretching, all really just like every single area. So I'm glad. And now I am going to be excited because as much as I hate VO2 training, I'll be thinking about my mitochondria, in my lungs or something getting better.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, the more you're working your lungs, the more your lungs are going to work.
And the heart. So I'll be just thinking about how good my mitochondria are getting there on my VO2. I love that. Okay, let's talk about the fasting and feeding. So this is a very controversial topic. So 90% of my followers are women. Obviously, I'm a woman. So there's a lot of information out there about fasting for women. And some people say you should. Some people say you shouldn't. I have my own perspective on all of it. But what does fasting and feeding look like? What do the windows look like for optimal mitochondria?
I'm not going to be super helpful on this, except maybe to make some people feel better about their own choices. So I think the principle is true. And I think the principle that you need to go through a genuine fasting feeding cycle is true. I think that most people don't. I think that's also true. So the average person who's snacking all day, that is the antithesis of a proper fasting feeding cycle. But what is the right one? Is it 1 meal a day, or is it to go on a 3-day fast once a month, or a 7-day fast once every 6 months? I have no idea. And the reason that I have no idea is that there's a lot of studies where you can show one thing benefits something compared to what the average person is doing. But I bet you anything that my grandparents believed that you should eat 3 square meals a day, and that would also outperform the average person who's snacking on junk food all day, right? So for one approach to be shown to benefit over what everyone else is doing is a pretty low bar in a study, right? And so what we really need to show conclusively that there is, or even compellingly, that there are strong benefits to one of those approaches versus another, you need randomized head-to-head trials of 1 meal a day versus 3 square meals a day, no snacking. And that's a lot harder to show a benefit when you're, instead of comparing it to the person who's snacking on junk food all day. So I think that the simplest way to take advantage of this that could be broadly applicable to everyone is when you do your cardio, make some of it or all of it in the fasting state. And that will take that period of fasting in the morning and it will accentuate the fasting signaling, but it doesn't have to be that long, right? So that I think is a lot easier to do for most people, because maybe, and now there are some people who say that they do optimal work in the fasting state. So if that's you, great.
That's my husband, actually.
Yeah, but there are other people who feel the opposite, right? So if you're someone who can't do anything productive in your day until you eat breakfast, then I think this is a great way to try to take advantage of that state, because the fasted cardio can accentuate that more than spending another 6 to 8 hours in the fasting state would. But now you're done with it and you can move on and so on. As to whether it's better for women or not, I think there is some, low quality evidence that is the case. I think intuitively a lot of people recognize that it probably is the case, but I also think it ultimately comes down to your own empirical verification of what's working for you, right? So you can start with the principle that there is some reason to believe that women should not be as aggressive with fasting as men should. And if that's true, that might be true for the average woman compared to the average man, but it's not necessarily true for every woman. And so the way that you approach that is either you're someone who's super quantified like you, where you could point to maybe 75 markers that change in a good or bad direction when you do any particular fasting regimen. But for someone who's not so quantified, I think you can get a very good intuitive grasp of whether the program is working for you based on how you feel. So a good signal that fasting is not working for you is if each time you fast, you're getting worse at being able to handle it. And that fasting should be relatively easy. If you are calm and lucid during your fast, that's a very good sign that it is working for you. Whereas if you're constantly hangry, that's a bad sign. But we all know that the first time we do high intensity interval training, we didn't handle it that well either, right? So I think the ultimate test is if you repeat that, are you getting better at it? And if you're not, that's a very big sign that you're doing too much for your ability to handle it.
Yeah. Also for women, I would say there's a lot of nuance and obviously bioindividuality around the cycle. So if you are already a very lean woman, and maybe you are having a little bit of luteal defect, so a shorter luteal phase, then fasting probably isn't for you. So yeah, there's so much nuance and bioindividuality around all of this. I mean, for me, I stop eating at 3 p.m. So my last meal's at 3, and then I don't eat again until 7 or 8 the next day. So I'm getting quite a few hours that are not fed. But is there like a minimum threshold that you think, like 6 hours not eating, 8 hours not eating, to do on a daily basis?
Well, I think overnight it would be quite a problem if you're not at least hitting 10 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. So an overnight fast, I mean, I think the average person should not be eating within 3 hours of bed unless they find that their sleep is a lot better when they do. But even in that case, you should still try to figure out what's the minimal distance or what's the maximal distance I can give without interfering with my sleep in such a case. And one of the justifications for that would simply be that laying down when your food is digesting and your gut is taking away the helpfulness of gravity, right? So if you are upright when your food is digesting, the work that your digestive system has to do in order to move that food along is a lot less, because it's a lot easier to move something down with gravity than to try to be moving it against or up. So especially people, I mean, this is really clear with people with digestive problems. A lot of people will get a lot of benefit just from not lying down for a few hours after they eat, and get even more benefit if they go for a walk after they eat. So, if you're not eating for 2 hours before bed and you're sleeping for 8 hours, you already have 10 hours right there. So if you're not getting 10 hours of fasting in, there's something wrong with that. Yeah. But I don't have a strong opinion outside of that. I mean, if you cannot go 6 hours without a meal in a day, there's probably something wrong, but you also might not be eating big enough meals either. Like it would be worth seeing too, if you, like, a good marker of your health would be that you're metabolically flexible enough to handle a few of these different approaches, right? Mm-hmm. So if you find that you need lunch 3 hours after you ate breakfast, that's not necessarily a bad sign, but you should probably be able to eat a bigger breakfast and then go longer before you need lunch. So if you eat twice as big a breakfast and you still need to eat lunch 3 hours later, you've probably got a metabolic flexibility problem. And I would go back to, like, yes, you need to train yourself to fast, but think of it as training something else. You don't take your goal where you want to be and then just do it. You say, okay, what's a bite that I can chew? And you use that stimulus to help you become more fit, just like you would with your exercise. So a great way to start is do a little fasting cardio in the morning. Like, I think that's just an excellent beginner's approach. And I think it's also just a habit that anyone at any stage could get some extra benefit from.
I love that. Okay, so we have the micronutrients, we have exercise, now we have this fasting and feeding schedule. What would go next on your list for mitochondria benefit?
Creatine is definitely on the list. So creatine is, if the mitochondria are your cellular power plant, then creatine is your power grid. Okay. So the role of creatine is to take the energy that the mitochondria have produced and spread it throughout the rest of the cell. And that is a way of assisting the mitochondria rather than nourishing the mitochondria directly. But if you don't have enough creatine in your cells, it's no good for your mitochondria to be working well, because creatine has to be there to carry that energy forward. And then the fifth one would be sunlight.
Can I ask one more question going back to the creatine? Yeah. So essentially a creatine is like, the creatine's acting as like a substrate for the mitochondria. What other would you rank as like the highest importance for mitochondria to function properly? If we put this in the bucket of, let's say, like, can we kind of put it in the bucket of a nutrient?
I wouldn't put it in the bucket of a micronutrient.
Yeah.
It's kind of in the bucket of a nutrient because you can eat it and it occurs in food.
Yeah. Okay, so I was going to put it
but
there.
It's not a vitamin and mineral. Yeah.
Yeah. So what else, if you were to give your top three real quick, and let's say creatine's maybe one or two.
What other nutrient that's not a vitamin or mineral would be necessary for mitochondria? If there is any, Well, CoQ10 would be the next one.
Okay.
But I think way more people need creatine than need CoQ10, and if you look at the randomized controlled trial literature, the average person is benefiting from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams of CoQ10. But I think that's because the average person's walking around with multiple nutrient deficiencies. And if you look at the synthesis path, like you make your own CoQ10. We all make our own CoQ10. If you look at the synthesis pathway, it's like one of the most complicated synthesis pathways I've ever seen. There's dozens of nutrients that are involved in it. So I think the reason that the average person is benefiting from 100 to 200 milligrams of CoQ10 is because the average person is walking around with multiple nutrient deficiencies that's hurting their CoQ10 synthesis. And, the average person who's optimizing all their vitamins and minerals with all the testing that you do, who then needs 100 to 200 milligrams of CoQ10 on top of that, that's probably not the average person with optimized micronutrients probably does not need CoQ10. And it's very possible that the average person who's fully optimized on the micronutrient front should not use CoQ10. Because if you look at the trial literature, basically shows that if you look at something like glucose, insulin, or blood pressure, while the average person's benefiting at 100 to 200 milligrams, the average person's getting a lot worse at 400 milligrams. Not a lot worse, but they're worse than baseline, right? So they're worse off than having never taken any CoQ10. Probably, if you double that to 800 milligrams, it's probably even worse. It's probably like a lot worse, actually, because usually once you get into adverse effect territory, you're in a place where doubling down on it is going to more than double the adverse effect. So if you view that as driven by the excess over what the person needed, you need less if your micronutrients are optimized. So it's totally conceivable, to me at least, that 1 to 200 milligrams is hurting you when your micronutrients are optimized because you just don't need it. So I do think that's another, that's one of the things that we look at in the Mitome test is, does the person here and now need CoQ10, and how bad does that look? Does it look like they just need to fill that in with 100 to 200 milligrams, or does it look like they need a whopping dose? So an interesting story from one of our customers. I had this woman who, in her 20s, she stopped having her period. 10 years later, she's gone through all kinds of different functional medicine. She's gone through, and the functional medicine, she went on a lot of supplements that actually included low dose CoQ10, homeopathy, the works, right? 2 weeks into, so her Mitome protocol looked like she was one of the ones who needed a lot of CoQ10. And so her protocol had her experiment with titrating up to 800 milligrams. And she did that quite rapidly. And within 2 weeks, she had her first period in 10 years. And now it's been a year and she still has totally normal menstruation now since then. So that was, that's an example of the kind of outsized returns you can see when someone has an idiosyncratic, unusual need that's highly unique to them. But anyway, but back to the point with the micronutrient testing, if you're already highly optimized, you probably don't need CoQ10, and you should rely on testing to see if you need it, or at least you should be, if you're doing as much testing as you're doing, you should also have real-time metrics that show you how you're responding to supplements. My favorite are looking at glucose and lactate together. But you should have something to tell you whether that's benefiting you or not, because I think there's a good chance it wouldn't. But to go back to the creatine's in a totally different category, because the data, so first of all, no supplement has been studied more than creatine has. And there's just this remarkable trend of whatever it's studied for, it looks great, right? So the only reason that it was isolated to strength for so long is because that's the only thing people studied. But every time they broaden that, it's like traumatic brain injury heals twice as fast when people take 20 grams of creatine. 1 night of sleep deprivation, 20 grams of creatine will cut down the sleepiness and double the brain power. And the reason is that there's really only one category of person who would get enough creatine in their diet in order to not need to supplement, and that's someone who's eating 1 to 2 pounds of meat per day. And that could be, if it's rarely cooked, that could be salmon and red meat. That could be 1 pound. And if it's well done and it's white fish or white meat, that's like 2 pounds. Most people aren't eating that. So it's just pretty much everyone needs the creatine. And I just don't think that's true with CoQ10.
What are the creatine recommendations looking like these days? I was doing 5 grams, but I've heard that they're now pushing upper limits.
What I would do is this. I would, as long as you tolerate it digestively and so on, do the loading dose, 20 grams for 4 or 5 days. The reason to do that is that you can start figuring out what your optimal dose is within a few weeks instead of a few months. Because once you saturate your muscle stores, the distribution of creatine starts changing. And if you don't do the loading dose, it's going to take a month to saturate your muscle stores. And so you can't even start thinking about what your optimal dose is until after that happens. So if you tolerate the loading dose, do it. Now on day 5 or day 6, you're starting to figure out your optimal dose. I would start with 2 or 3 grams. And I would take 2 or 3 grams for a week or two, and I would observe what happens to your health. The more quantified you are, the better, because then your quantification can tell you. A lot of people's intuition, some people's intuition is perfect for supplements, but most people's are not. So the more quantified you are, the more you have real-time data that's actually telling you. And then the more consistent you are, the quicker you can get a sense of what your data mean, right? So if you're one of those people who every week they're on a new jet to somewhere else, and they're never eating a consistent diet, then it takes you longer to figure it out. But let's say you more or less eat similarly all the time, you're more or less in one place, you're highly quantified. Look at what happens to your health data over the course of those 2 or 3 weeks, then start popping the dose up by about 1 gram a day per week. I think that the best way to take it is to distribute it across all your meals and take it right before the meal. And I say this because there is some literature suggesting that the amount you can absorb at any given time is kind of small. Or it's not 5, like if you take 5 grams, you're going to absorb less than if you take 1 or 2 grams. But I also did some testing on myself where I was in a dose range where each gram of creatine was giving me 6 minutes of extra total sleep. So I did this randomized experiment on myself of different ways of taking it. And I found that the sleep impact was maximized when I took it away from my meal. But when I took it away from my meal, I had to take salt with it in order to normalize my digestive function, which meant I had to move salt. It was just a pain in the butt. And I found that I got most of the benefit from taking it distributed across the day before each meal, had a lot of benefit over taking it all at once. And it had a reasonable benefit over taking it at the end of the meal instead of the beginning. So as you go up in the dose, if you can, try to distribute it across the day. Try to take it before each meal. Or you can also take some after your workout. That'll help it go into your muscles better. It's been hypothesized, not quite proven, that if you do it after you've done a bunch of brain puzzles, it might get into your brain better. But I think that's a little too much hassle. So take it before each meal and spread it out. If you find that too difficult to deal with, take it however you want, but just keep it consistent across your experiment so that as you go up in dose, you're only changing the dose, right? Go up in dose by about 1 gram per day per week, and then see where you start to see diminishing returns. If you see diminishing returns, you should probably pull back by 1 gram, because if you're seeing diminishing returns over the course of 4, 5, 6 weeks, over the long haul, you're trying to dial in something that you can just continue taking, across the next year, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So once you see diminishing returns, pull back to the most recent dose and then stay there. I think a reasonable stopping point for a lot of people is going to be in the 2 to 5 gram range. Some people, it's going to be in the 7, 8 gram range. It is theoretically possible that for some people it's in the 20 gram range, but the thing is, the reason people are pushing higher and higher doses is because we're seeing trials of benefits of 20 grams, but none of those trials are comparing to 5 grams.
Yeah.
And none of those trials are like, if you do creatine supplementation in someone who hasn't supplemented with it, now you've got all kinds of new problems because they're saturating their muscle stores and they're saturating them way more quickly on 20 than on 5 or on 2. So the designs of the studies are not good enough to tell people that there's a new optimal dose of creatine, but they do give us the idea that we should play around with it and see what benefits us the most. So I'm on 8 grams right now, but I'm unsure of whether I should go back down to 6 or if I should go up higher, and I'm going to start playing around with it in next month.
Nice. Well, you'll have to let us know how it goes.
Yeah, I will.
Is there any reason to think that, like, if you're a woman and you weigh less, like maybe you need less? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, there's every reason to think that, but I wouldn't modify the ranges based on what I just said. So our best knowledge is that the sex effect is entirely a function of the lean body mass effect, and your creatine requirement is going to be a function of your lean body mass. And so if you weigh a lot more, you're going to need more creatine. But it just comes back to what I said before. You should figure out what your optimal dose is. If the experiment that I just described sounds like too much for you, 5 grams.
Nice.
Yeah.
Easy enough. And are most of these studies being done with just monohydrate? I mean, there's kind of some stir on the internet that there are better forms of creatine for women that cause less bloating.
I have not seen that demonstrated, but it sounds interesting. Creatine monohydrate has been overwhelmingly the form that's studied across many thousands of studies, and there is no clear demonstration that there is anything better than that. And so, but then there's always been some hype around why you should take esterified creatine or creatine HCl, buffered creatine. I think I would start with taking it with salt. And if that doesn't work, I would try getting my potassium up. And the reason is that, well, salt is a more likely explanation for why you would need diarrhea, or for why you would get diarrhea with creatine, but it is a possible explanation for why you would get bloating. Potassium is a better explanation for bloating if it's a long-term effect, right? So if it's just you took creatine, you're bloated today, and it's gone by tomorrow, I'm going to think you need salt, because you need salt to absorb it. And that might just be a function of you have GI problems anyway, because, you know, if it's getting stuck in your stomach or something like that, or it's just like not moving along the intestines, that's probably more of a function of underlying GI dysfunction than it is of creatine. But if you're taking creatine and you become more bloated over time as a result of it, that's probably a potassium deficit, because creatine moves potassium into cells, which decreases the amount of potassium outside the cells, and not having enough potassium in the gastrointestinal fluids causes gastrointestinal paralysis. So I have a whole guide on my website to handling creatine side effects, where it covers bloating, and it covers hair loss, and it covers restless legs, and it covers anger. And
Oh, wow.
I collected all so I came out with an article that was, so there's a lot of people who say this is total nonsense because none of the trials have shown that any of this stuff actually happens. But I don't take that perspective. I think that you get in the trials you show it's really common, and then anecdotally on the internet you see the long tail distribution of what are the rare problems that people get from it. And you can think they're more common than they are when you spend a lot of time on the internet. But its trials miss things all the time. And so I'm inclined to trust the anecdotes as at least demonstrations of what can happen. And so when I came out with an article that said pretty much everyone should be taking creatine, you know, people came out of the woodwork across all my platforms with dozens of comments of, when I take creatine, it does this. So I just collected all of them and I said, okay, what is the most likely reason creatine would make you angry? What is the most likely reason that creatine would, cause bloating versus diarrhea versus twitching versus the next thing. And so that guide kind of walks you through an algorithm of, if this is the problem, this is the most likely thing, but it could be this, or this. And so try these things in that order. But the other thing you can do with the creatine is you can microdose it. So one of the people who had used our test had catastrophic post-SSRI withdrawal mitochondrial dysfunction. And his history was it was partly about switching SSRIs and it was partly about getting off them entirely, but he had muscle cramps waking him up at night. He had twitching. He couldn't travel because whenever he was traveling, his stress level would increase and he would wind up in an urgent care because he was peeing too much and he was twitching all over the place and his heart was beating too fast and all this stuff. And he lost 17 pounds of muscle during this period. Wow. So his Mitome protocol had put him on creatine, but it, the sort of, if you have problems with it, go to these strategies. What he wound up doing is bringing the dose down to 100 milligrams for months. And he found that led to this, and by the way, what his results showed was that he had this idiosyncratic problem transporting the process of methylation, which is, anyone who's heard of MTHFR, like that's what that's all about, transporting that into his mitochondria. And so it showed that his mitochondria were limited by their methylation capacity. The reason creatine is there is creatine's not just spreading mitochondrial energy through the rest of the cell, but that actually has this very unique interaction with methylation in that to make creatine, you use methylation to make it, but then methylation itself is driven by mitochondrial energy production in the form of ATP. And if you don't have mitochondrial energy production or you don't have creatine distributing that energy, your methylation fails. So you get caught in this vicious cycle of creatine deficit, energy deficit, methylation deficit. So anyway, 100 milligrams of creatine for months is what allows him to start titrating up the creatine. So, you can try to, if you get, say, heart palpitations, you can try dealing with the electrolyte issue, but you can also just try going down on the dose. And I don't think many people need this, but when you say everyone should do something, you're going to get all these responses for people for whom it doesn't work. I've been convinced that if you don't need creatine, you take creatine, it does nothing. If you take creatine, it destabilizes your system. The creatine is probably fixing something, but it's fixing it way too fast. Yeah. And you need to go way down on the dose, and you need to either find the balancing things that help you tolerate it, or you need to just cut the dose down and allow your body and your current regime to take care of it itself, but over time. But yeah, I mean, that's an edge case of where some people could, or that's the range of ways that you could handle the creatine problems.
Yeah, I love that. I think you made a post on Instagram not too long ago that said, essentially, like, RCTs are great, right? But like N of 1 data is also incredibly valuable. And trying these different strategies on yourself, if you're paying attention or if you can access labs. I mean, I love that you think that way, because obviously, based on what I'm doing, I also think that way.
Well, the crazy thing is, so does the guy who invented evidence-based medicine. So the reason that we have randomized controlled trials now and why they're considered gold standard evidence is because in the 1980s and before, there weren't a lot of randomized controlled trials, and people were doing medicine on what the doctor who taught them to do medicine was doing, which was based on what the doctor that taught him to do medicine was doing, which was based on what the doctor who taught, and just went back in a chain of what people just thought they should do. And randomized controlled trials started coming out and saying, like, oh, actually, you think that the person who has such and such problem needs to stay in bed for weeks, but actually they get worse when you do that. I forgot what the problem was, but David Sackett, who was one of the founders of evidence-based medicine, this was one of his primary motivations was everyone believed that whatever this health problem was, I forgot what it was, that you had to keep the patient in bed for 2 weeks. They couldn't get up to pee. They couldn't get up and go anywhere. And the patients hated it because they were like, what do you mean I have to stay in bed? Like, I'm fine. I can get up. I can walk around.
Yeah.
And they were forcing them to. And it was obviously very disturbing to them. And so they did a randomized controlled trial of it, and it showed that everything that the doctors believed was they were supposed to do was the opposite of what they should do. And in fact, if they just listened to the patients complaining, they probably would have gotten better results than if they had relied on their own authority. But so Gordon Guyat and David Sackett, who has now passed away, founded evidence-based medicine in 1991. Guyat coined the term. And there's this pyramid that floats around that says that systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials are the highest level of evidence. So I was like, where did this come from? Because in the early literature, you don't see any pyramids. So it turns out this guy, C.J. Hunt, had found that at SUNY Downstate in 1997, they were doing teaching materials. The reference librarian invented this pyramid, not a doctor. Not a doctor, not a scientist, a reference librarian, right? And if you go into Gordon Guyat's materials, he published his first hierarchy of evidence in his textbook in 2001, and it has N=1 trials at the top, above systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. So these are the guys that essentially invented the fact that we rely on randomized controlled trials, and they're the ones who say that N=1 is at the top. Now, it should be clarified that everyone on the internet, in the biohacking space, paleo, whoever's doing self-experiments, they call N=1. They just mean I tried it on myself and I looked at what happened. That does correspond to how even evidence-based doctors will give you something and see what happens. But it doesn't correspond to being better than a randomized controlled trial. What corresponds to being better than a randomized controlled trial on other people is a randomized controlled trial on yourself. And this is kind of a pain to do, and no one recommends that people routinely do them for everything or for no reason. But when you are an optimizer and you are trying something and it seems to work and then the effect fades away, or if you're just really unsure if it's helping because the background variability is so high, then it can be, as long as the time horizon that you expect it to work over is days or weeks and not 6 to 12 months or longer, then a randomized experiment is an amazing way to test whether something's really working. So my example is I thought switching out nixtamalized corn tortillas for sprouted quinoa was going to help my sleep. I did that, and it seemed to add 40 minutes of sleep.
40 minutes?
Yes.
Wow.
But when I look back on it, it seemed to fade away over time. I'm like, if I look at my more recent data, my sleep's going back down. It got very confusing to me. And I think what was happening was when I added it in, I had been leaning out, and my calories are going back up to a maintenance phase. So I was sleeping more because of that, and it led to a false positive result. So I do a randomized experiment where I make my food in batches of 4-day batches. So I say, okay, I can have 4 days of corn, then 4 days of quinoa, or I can have 4 days of quinoa, then 4 days of corn. So I call one order 1, I call the other order 2. I use a random number generator to give me a bunch of 1s and 2s, come up with a sequence where it's totally randomly distributed. And then I collect my data and I look at the stats. And what it showed was I got 7.24 hours of sleep on all of my quinoa trials. I got 7.24 hours of sleep on all of my corn trials, which was incredibly high quality, better than a randomized controlled trial on other people, randomized controlled trial on myself, showing with the highest quality of evidence that my hypothesis was totally wrong, that quinoa was going to help my sleep. Not only that, I showed that quinoa did cause a 20% drop in my energy.
Wow.
Yeah.
Dang. So no washout period needed then here?
Well, no, you can. I have a guide on my website called how to optimize anything. And the last section in there is when and how to randomize. So you do need a washout period if there's a lead in or a lag effect. But look at it this way. you never should do a randomized experiment on yourself if you haven't first done an observational study, which is just try the thing and see if it works. And if you're someone as quantified as you are, as quantified as I am, you have very rigorous data about what happened. You just have no basis for saying what caused what.
Yeah.
Right. And so if your observational data on what happens when I switch out quinoa for corn, you can look at that and you can say, is there a lead-in effect? Is there a lag effect where, if my hypothesis is correct, every time I take creatine, I get bloating the day after, and then it goes away. If that's your hypothesis, then you need a lead-in period and you need a washout period, because you need to be able to, it's going to take one day before you see the effect, and the effect is going to last a day. So I would say build your lead-in and washout periods based on what your observations indicate you think is the case.
Yeah, I love that. Well, we should have a sidebar at some point. Maybe I do a few, because this is something that I really want to start doing and implementing into my work, is these RCTs on myself.
Yeah.
But maybe we pick a couple interesting topic matters, whether it's mitochondria with different, I would love to see what happens with like 40 sessions of HBOT or something in mitochondria, or even a few sessions.
Yeah.
Have you looked at that at all?
So one of the things that the Mitom test also does is tell you if it seems like you're getting too little or too much oxygen. And that's because there's specific patterns that cause mitochondrial adaptations to that. I think that hypoxic stress is more of a specific dose response where too much is clearly bad for you. And there are clearly adaptations, because people who live at altitude or have adaptations to a lot of the short-term problems that develop. But what you'll see is that there's like some level of altitude where you start to see longevity benefit. But even there, it's a trade-off, because like the highest altitude places in the United States compared to the lowest altitude places, people live longer, but they also have 3 times the risk of depression. So you're getting bioenergetic trade-offs at any level of altitude carried out over time. But even if you look at people in who live like in really high mountains across the world, I think you're seeing a general net negative, even though they're adapted to all the things you would experience if you just go to the mountains for a week yourself.
Yeah.
And so what that tells you is that too much hypoxic stress is just clearly bad across the board. And in the trials of athletes, it looks like the best protocol I've ever seen for increasing testosterone in male athletes is 10 to 12 hours of an altitude tent 3 times per week, simulating 6,500 feet of altitude, used in the evening and throughout the night's sleep.
Interesting.
Now, if they don't take a rest between those days, you start to see the benefits in the first day start wearing off by 5 days. And if you just do it continuously, but now there's another study though that showed that recovering drug addicts, they just have this testosterone. If they go to the mountains of Tibet and they go hiking, the testosterone just goes up the whole time. And so I think it depends, whether you're an athlete or whether you're a recovering drug addict, or you're somewhere in between.
Yes.
I think that can make a difference. But my core belief is that probably a healthy person should be getting the equivalent of 6,500 feet altitude for 20% of the time. And so I'm going to be doing an experiment on myself. I want to see if I can replicate the studies in the athletes by going into the mountains for 5 days a month. And my hypothesis is that I'm going to look at the Mitom test serially over time, and then I'm going to do a bunch of blood work serially over time that looks at all the different markers of the hypoxia response in the blood. And I'm also going to look at some other stuff like my rate of manganese excretion, but that's a whole nother story. So what I think is going to happen is that I'm going to see an initial benefit in the first day or so. At 5 days, in some ways, it's going to look like too much stress on my body, but then it's going to then a bounce back is going to happen the whole rest of the month, where by the end of the month, I'm better off than I was at the beginning. And then if that's repeated, it's just like repeating exercise. You just get more fit and more fit over time.
Yeah.
I hope that that's true. But all I did was I said, if it's 10 to 12 hours, 3 times a week, if you condense that into a monthly average, what would it look like? And I'm like, I would much rather go into the mountains for 5 days a month than I would do that protocol, you know? Yeah. So I'd love to know if we can, but anyway, with the HBOT, I think it's less clear that there would be such a clear isolated dose that you would want. But of course, no one spends that 20% of their time in an HBOT.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots to test on this.
Yeah, I'm also getting, have you heard of a Cell Gym? It's hypoxic training essentially, but it's pretty intense. And one of their main benefits, as they state, is mitochondrial improvements. So yeah.
Is that what's the basic methodology there? Is it?
Yeah, it's a mask that essentially is, reducing the amount of oxygen. You're doing something.
And how long do you use it for? Okay, got it.
Yeah. I'll get the full protocol. They're going to come drop it off and show me like exactly what to do, and then I'll follow it to a T. But yeah, maybe I'll do this test that I have here before that, because that is obviously, it's one of the main benefits is supposed to be mitochondrial improvement. So we could test.
All I can say is that the hypoxic workouts do not reliably raise testosterone in males. And I guess that's a pretty limited statement, but at the moment, I do think that the testosterone is a predictable response to the hypoxia. It's not an idiosyncratic male athlete thing. And so for that reason, because I feel like it's the most robustly studied hypoxic related endpoint that intersects with health, I take that as my guiding light right now to thinking about what's the dose of hypoxic stress that you need. And I think the issue is just that even if you combine it with a workout, it's just like an hour workout 3 times a week, it's just not enough hypoxic stress, because you're not, like, the duration of the hypoxia when you're doing it for 36 hours a week is just, it overwhelms the fact that you're combining it with a workout.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that there's no mitochondrial benefits to it. And that also doesn't mean that you wouldn't see the effect over a longer period of time, because most of these trials are just too short. So it's like over the trial period, you didn't see it. But that might be a thing where maybe, there are diseases like Crohn's disease, for example, where there's a bunch of case series on HBOT for Crohn's, and they look like you got to do 40 to 80 sessions before you induce remission, right?
Yeah.
So maybe 40 to 80 of the Cell Gym sessions.
I think actually their base protocol is 40 sessions. I want to say they're like an hour.
Yeah,
it's
that makes a lot of sense.
A little while since I've had that conversation with them, but I think that's what it looks like. So
cool.
I mean, could be a
that lines up a lot with what I was thinking. So
yeah. Oh, good. Love that. Okay. Well, let's go back to the list now.
Yeah.
So we had micronutrients, exercise, fasting, and feeding. Creatine was on that list. What would you say is the next item for optimal mitochondrial function?
The sun. And of course that intersects with a lot of biohacking tech issues, but principally, a lot of people talk about the importance of sunlight for circadian regulation, where morning sunlight is the thing that comes out. And then there's also an important aspect of sunlight in the mid-afternoon, that's where you get your vitamin D.
Yeah.
And then there's another important aspect of sunlight, which is just that at every time in the day, in your eyes, it is way better of a spectrum for your eye health and your brain health than artificial lighting is, even the best of artificial lighting that's meant to mimic the sun. And so I think the best top level advice around the sun is get at least 30 minutes of morning sunshine every day. Get at least a few minutes of unprotected broad skin exposure to the sun around solar noon that you will have to vary according to your skin sensitivity. So someone with very light skin, maybe a couple of minutes, someone with very dark skin, maybe a couple of hours.
I use an app called, I want to say like
D-Minder?
Luxmeter.
Oh, Luxmeter.
Oh, and
okay.
I've used D-Minder too. Obviously in summer, let's say Austin, the UV index is like 12. It's crazy here. So do you have like an amount, and it can count the vitamin D supposedly that you're getting. Is there like an amount that you're aiming for?
I think using the D-Minder app to try to aim for like 4,000 or 5,000 IU of vitamin D is a good metric. With the Luxmeter, I would say if you live in an area where the Luxmeter is saying that your morning sunshine is consistently under 10,000, you should consider adding to the morning sunshine a phototherapy lamp that provides you 10,000 lux.
Yeah.
But I say adding because I don't think there's any artificial light that totally makes up for the sun. And so it's like maybe the intensity isn't enough, but you still want that spectrum as the prime signal going through your eyes at that time of day. Yeah. And without the Luxmeter, I think a lot of people get fooled because they think that it's not light out. They're like, oh, there is no sun. But yeah, well, actually, it's 100 times brighter than your indoor lighting. You don't notice because your eyes adjust. So I think 30 minutes of outdoor exposure to whatever is in the sky in the morning is a non-negotiable. Getting enough vitamin D in whatever way you do it is a non-negotiable. And then I think the optimal, but too impractical for many, is spend the whole rest of the day in as close to you can as indirect outdoor light. So the ideal thing would be if you had a workstation outside that shielded you from the sun, but illumined everything you're looking at in your work in the sun, which ideally would not involve a computer screen in the sun, right? So that's like the ideal. What can you do practically? I would say just like if you have to be indoors, you have to be on the computer, just try to construct your office so that it has natural lighting and you don't need to turn the lights on inside.
Yeah. Is it beneficial to open the door? Is that kind of the same concept or not really? Like
you mean for example, you mean like if it's kind of rainy outside and you want to get your morning sunlight?
No, like my desk.
Yeah.
So the desk is here. I have these massive windows. So I crank open and not only have the shades open, but also crank open. So I have like fresh air, which is obviously beneficial. But is there you're talking about building a tent kind of outside that is protecting you? If you have like a large window source?
I just meant, I guess, like if you go back to sort of our equatorial history, all the animals and the people there are hiding under a rock during the hot sun in the middle of the afternoon, but they're still outside. Yeah. So my point is, you don't want to get a sunburn, but you don't want to, but the sun should still be the reason you see everything.
Yeah.
Okay. And so however you want to approximate that is, so like that's the ideal, but yeah, if you are in an office and you open the window so the worst case scenario would be there's no natural lighting, you have to turn on the artificial light. The happy medium is the natural light comes in your window, and the best thing is you open it. And part of the reason is that the government hates your mitochondria and the window industry hates your mitochondria, and so the more they make the windows and the light bulbs environmentally friendly, the more they have the exact wrong spectrum for your mitochondrial needs. And so the worst, if you have an energy efficient window, then you have to open it because energy efficient windows hate your mitochondria.
And it blocks out like all the good things.
It blocks out all the good stuff. Yeah. And it always blocks out the ultraviolet light. The ultraviolet light is the tricky one because you definitely can overdose on it.
Yeah.
But you can definitely underdose on it too. So, but that's why I say indirect though too. You don't want the sun beating right on your skin the entire day.
Yeah. Have you heard of like a spurty lamp? That's like a vitamin. Do you think those are beneficial for people that really just don't have
they are if you don't have access to vitamin D synthesizing UV light.
Yeah. How much truth do you feel that there is to when you are receiving or creating vitamin D from the sun, you getting a significant health benefit versus just taking supplementation?
It's hard to prove, but there are plenty of indications that that's the case. So it's interesting. It's definitely superior for skin problems that are responsive to phototherapy. For psoriasis, for example, there are studies showing that the sun is vastly superior to everything else, including doctor-administered narrowband phototherapy, and definitely including vitamin D supplementation. Although vitamin D also helps. So vitamin D is just one part of the story there. So there's definite benefits to the sun per se, not just vitamin D as a byproduct. And there are various ways that people try to explain that, whether it's nitric oxide production in the skin or even vitamin D gets degraded into a plethora of vitamin D byproducts by the sun. And those all have anti-psoriasis activity. So that could be one reason why the sun's better than vitamin D for psoriasis. But I just think that I think it's interesting to try to come up with all the different causes, but I think it's misguided to try to reduce the sunlight to those causes, because every time someone tries to reduce the sunlight to those causes, that, this is how we wound up with artificial light in the first place. They said, oh, the reason we need the sun is so we can see what we're reading. And then that's how we wound up in the whole problem at the beginning. So I think you never know what you don't know. So I think it's a huge mistake to think that you figured out why the sun is beneficial and now you can replicate it. Now, that's not to say that I'm against using red light, near infrared light therapy, which are some of the beneficial wavelengths of the sun. But it is to say that you shouldn't be doing that before you've optimized your sun exposure.
Yeah.
So get your sun, and if you need more red light or you need more near infrared, then you can add a device on top of that.
Yeah.
But don't use that as a replacement for the sun, because you're just thinking about it wrong if you think that's the reason why the sun is good for you.
Yeah. Going back to vitamin D, what do you like to keep your vitamin D at? Like what level?
I actually don't hyper optimize my vitamin D level, and it often is around like 50 nanograms per milliliter without me trying to get it there. But I would say I wouldn't worry about mine unless it fell below like 35. Maybe I would. Depends. If it was 35 at the end of winter, I wouldn't care. But if it was 35 at the end of summer, I'd start looking at it more carefully. But I think this is another case where there's a few percent of people that really need their vitamin D higher than that. And so another interesting case, where I had a biochemical optimization program last year where I was running the Mitome alongside some genetic testing and some other stuff. And I had someone who, his problem was basically all about low testosterone, and his testosterone was low. He had gynecomastia that had been surgically removed. His primary complaints were fatigue, low libido, low stress under pressure, low exercise performance. And his Mitome results showed a pattern that looked like iron delivery to his mitochondria was deficient. And combined with a couple other genetic results, it really put a pin in vitamin D activating a particular protein that's involved in iron transport. And this was partly based on his historical data too. But anyway, the literature say that when you go up from, say, much lower than 20 up to 30 nanograms per milliliter, you're going to get a testosterone benefit. But if you go from 30 to 40 or 30 to 60 or 30 to 80, you're not going to get one. When he went from 35 into, let's say, 75 to 95, his protocol tripled his testosterone from in the high 100s to the high 400s.
Nice.
And But what's interesting after that is that we reran the mitome test and it showed that the iron-related deficit had been resolved. But after he got the mitochondrial benefit, he stopped seeing a correlation with his testosterone. And he started finding that, for example, oh, and by the way, like his testosterone tripling was not the main thing. The main thing was his libido went back up. He went from cold intolerant to going without a shirt in January.
Nice.
And he started running 5K marathon for the first time in his life. And he also reported a dramatic personality change from someone who had been anxiously hyper-focused on his work to a well-balanced person with more equanimity who took everything in stride. But anyway, what was interesting though was that his testosterone result was really mid compared to his health changes, right? Like you never say someone, wow, your total testosterone is 476. Yeah. You should be able to run a 5K marathon in January. Yeah. And so he found that he could keep improving all those health metrics at that point, even though his testosterone didn't go up anymore, or his testosterone could go up and it didn't make any difference. And what I think is interesting about that is that what does testosterone even do? It signals where to direct your energy. We were talking before we started recording, you were talking about how in women, the mitochondrial density is so high in the oocytes, right? Well, all the female hormonal architecture, what is it doing? It's just directing the energy into the particular place that hormone signals it should go. And so if you improve the ultimate responder to testosterone is not the androgen receptor. That's an intermediate that communicates the signal, but the ultimate responder is that in the tissues that are most sensitive to the androgen receptor, you get increase in mitochondrial function that increases the energy production and expenditure in those places, right? And so some of those effects are for a given amount of energy, the more androgen signaling you have, the less you care about your hair, and the more you care about your brain and your reproductive function. And so some people look at that and they say, well, instead of increasing the abundance of energy so I don't have to make the trade-off with my hair, I'm going to counteract that signaling and I'm going to benefit my hair, but at the expense of what? Well, as it turns out, there's a post-finasteride syndrome that involves sexual dysfunction, et cetera. But anyway, in his case, what I think that shows is that the reason his total testosterone was very correlated to his health on the way up, and then it just split apart, is that what was really being optimized, the core of it, was his ability to respond to testosterone with his mitochondrial function. And his mitochondrial function became so good that he wasn't as reliant on the signaling. He just needed enough signaling because he had a very robust response. And so he didn't need higher than 476 testosterone in order to get all the benefits that other people would need 800 or 900 to get. But the reason I brought that up is because of vitamin D. He's a case where going from 30 to 80 was incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
But that's not the case for me, and I don't think it's the case for the average person.
Yeah. Interesting. At my clinic, the consensus in the functional medicine, we would hire medical doctors and then they would be functionally trained. We would typically want people to aim for between 50 to 80, somewhere in that range. I keep mine around 70. It's interesting because, 80% of women the autoimmune conditions are women, 80%. So there is some also interesting literature kind of connecting higher vitamin D levels to potentially lower. Obviously, it's a very multifactorial reason why do you get autoimmune conditions, but also for me, I'm thinking through maybe higher vitamin D for reducing the risk. I don't have any autoimmune conditions, but I also don't want to get any. So yeah, I mean, again, bio-individual, right?
Well, I think part of that is how you see the trade-off of, making sure that everyone, if what I think you're actually doing, and I think you indicated this at the end, is that you're trying to cover the needs of say 99% of people instead of 95% of people. And so there's a few percent of people that benefit in getting from 35 to 65. And if you don't know who you are, then you're going to see that whatever the downside risk for those people of not being that high enough is not going to happen in that population. I am a little more conservative about it because I believe that you wind up hitting into other nutritional imbalances that are difficult to navigate. And there's not as, the mainstream belief in the vitamin D community is that you can't get any problems with calcium until you cause hypercalcemia. And I don't believe that. I believe that what you start getting is imbalances with vitamin A and vitamin K2. And that's where you start causing problems where you could accelerate the risk of cardiovascular or renal calcification. And I think there are other things that can be other downside risks that are less clearly laid out because of that. Now, if you're running, comprehensive micronutrient testing on everyone that you're getting up there, that gives you the ability to look out for those things and make those corrections otherwise. But the average person who's being told to go to 80 nanograms per milliliter vitamin D is, not running a Vibrant panel quarterly. So that's where my concern is.
Yeah, no, that's good and valid. And yeah, something I like to think about because it makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we have the sun, and then we haven't talked about sleep yet. I have to think sleep goes on that list.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Well, when you go to sleep, your mitochondria take a little nap. And they don't go down to, you don't go down to zero either, but your mitochondria make less ATP, which is the primary currency of cellular energy. But your metabolic rate goes down so far that the little ATP that they make can replace all the cellular energy that you had used up the day before. And so there are other functions to sleep. People could debate for the next century what the purpose of dreaming is. But for deep sleep, and there are other things that have been noted, like the removals of waste and so on, which is energy dependent, waste from the brain. Yeah. But I think the primary thing going on is that you just as you can't be, just as like every day can't be your hardest workout day of the week, every 8-hour period can't be your most alert period of the day. Yeah. And so we have to, we're going into debt when we're at our peak activity and we're repaying that debt during sleep. And that's primarily because our metabolic rate goes down so low that our mitochondria, even though they're resting too, that they're restoring that energy. And I think you can see things that tie together all these different things we've been talking about, like depression, for example. It's threefold higher in regions of altitude where people don't have enough oxygen for their mitochondria to use to produce cellular energy, but it's also twofold higher for people who have insomnia. Yeah. And so, what is that telling you? It's that depression is largely a deficit of brain energy.
Yeah. So if we're looking at like metrics for example, would we want to really prioritize the deep sleep? So I'm typically aiming for 2 hours per night of deep sleep. Do you think that's a reasonable range?
Yeah, to me, 2 hours of deep and 2 hours of REM are both good.
Okay, good. That's exactly what I'm going for. So wonderful. It's just, that's again where, I don't want to make everyone's life too complicated, but it's like if you're going to bed for 7 to 8 hours or 6 to 8 hours, but you're not getting any deep sleep, this is a problem because we know now you've educated us our mitochondria are kind of optimizing, but then also the brain's lymphatic system being the most active. So, just taking a peek under the hood, I feel is so important,
For sure. I think if you track with an Oura ring and you're looking at that stuff, I think you can get a sense of what is the variable that's most responsive to what you're doing and what's the one that kind of take care of the rest. So I actually optimize around my total sleep because I do think there are some things that I can do that cause them to diverge a little bit, but for the most part, if I'm hitting my target for total sleep, I'm also hitting my target for deep and REM. But, if you find that you are getting 7.5, 8 hours of total sleep and you're getting 1 hour of deep sleep, then you definitely want to figure out how you can sleep more deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Anything else that we would add to this list?
Well, I think that's the core list of things that are for everyone.
Yeah.
A lot of people would say that a lot of other things are things for everyone, and I kind of disagree. As we talked about, I think creatine is kind of iffy, but I think a lot of things that people say are just great mitochondrial nutrients across the board are actually things that you really want to be doing testing before you play around with, unless you're just so hyper quantified that you're using your own real-time testing on the efficacy of them. But if we take, for example,
I think just as a side note about that, I think people can subscribe to it being too much like almost like a religion or something, where they think that they're so interested in this thing working that their judgment is clouded by whether or not the efficacy is actually there or not. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree with that. And then, I mean, yeah, it is, so like some endpoints are incredibly vulnerable to placebo and nocebo effects. So like your perception of depression is a great example. The most effective treatment that anyone has ever developed for depression is the placebo effect. And, if you look at drug trials, the average efficacy of an SSRI, for example, is 54%. But the average efficacy of the placebos in those trials is 40%, which means that 75% of the treatment effect of the SSRI is placebo effect. But that's true across the board. There are hundreds of trials of exercise, psychotherapy, hundreds of trials each of psychotherapy, hundreds of trials in nutritional supplements, and hundreds of trials of exercise for depression. And it's always the case that there's a huge placebo effect. And so, that kind of tells you that if what you're rating is your mood and you're trying PQQ or CoQ10 and your mood went up, well, wait till 6 months from now what you think about that finding. You might have changed your mind because you don't know why it's not working anymore. And that is an example where, maybe with depression, you don't want to give such a great logistic burden to someone as to do a randomized experiment. But maybe if you're helping someone with depression, you might want to do a randomized experiment. If you can take, like if you're a practitioner, for example, and you have the bandwidth and you have the time required per patient, that might be a case where you taking on the logistic, in that case, you can even blind the treatment if you want to really see if something is working, as long as you have a grasp of what the time scale it should work on is. But then there are other things like, so for example, methylene blue, I think, starts becoming an antidepressant drug at around 10 milligrams. People argue about this, but I base this off the animal experiments show that the brain concentration is 10 times the plasma concentration. So a lot of people look at the plasma results and they say that, it doesn't have a antidepressant effect until you hit 100 milligrams. I'm like, well, yeah, you're not accounting for the fact that the brain is tenfold enriched in it. So take the same math and it's 10 milligrams. Yeah. And, you can, if you're taking a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, you can think that you're massively improving your mitochondrial function, but what you're actually doing is you're just increasing your dopamine level. Yeah. And so I think that becomes more difficult to interpret. So the Mitome test does, analyze whether someone's a good candidate for methylene blue and then put it where we believe it belongs in the protocol. But I think that's an example, like the animal experiments show that if you have a bottleneck, then methylene blue will help work around that bottleneck. But if you don't have a bottleneck, you wind up with lower ATP production because methylene blue rewires a mitochondria that was already working correctly. And you can't make it work better than the pathway that is the default. Yeah. And so I think that's a case where you either want a test that tells you need it, or you want to have such good data quality that you can say, oh, when I took methylene blue, this is what happened.
Yeah.
But you want something besides your mood or how much energy you have during the day to indicate that. You want something biochemical that's not a potential downstream byproduct of the antidepressant effect boosting your mood, making you think that you're better off.
Yeah.
So if you're tracking your glucose and your lactate, I think that would be an excellent example. A lot of people track glucose, I think, testing lactate alongside it. I actually test glucose, ketones, and lactate together, but glucose and lactate
monitor.
I use a Nova Biomedical Lactate Plus, but I'm open to being convinced that there's a better one, but that's what I'm using right now.
Yeah, I'll have to try that. Okay, so it's kind of funny because I think back. It's not really funny, but I remember doing like IV mitochondria or IV methylene blue like 5 years ago. And I'm kind of slightly sad because I feel like my mitochondria was probably fine. Hopefully I didn't do too much damage.
Well, you look healthy, so I
Well,
think I think you can assume if your current health is good and it's going in a positive direction that you didn't do too much damage.
It didn't like rewire them like too crazy.
Well, it's not a permanent rewiring. It's a temporary rewiring.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, it was so fun, but I mean, and I felt amazing because I'm sure I forgot how many milligrams, but it was over 10 for sure. And
and it was intravenous. So
I mean, I felt great. So I was like, this definitely works.
I'm sure you did.
Yeah. Okay. So methylene blue is a big one. Can we talk about like a little bit of nuance around red light? Because I feel like, and you mentioned that you like red light, not prioritizing it over the sun, but what about the dosing of red light? So can't you overdo it, or isn't there kind of like a Goldilocks rule with red light therapy where you want to take a break?
Yeah, I mean, there's advice out there that's like 10 or 15 minutes per session, but I don't know that we have. I'm sure that's true. I don't know that we have the data that we would really like to be able to say exactly how many minutes. And it's going to depend what device you're using too, because you could be like in a bed where it's right on you, or you could be in front of a panel where you're a little further away from it. A lot of the areas of your body are being hit indirectly. You need to turn around and add more. I do think that until we have like really solid data about that, it's even if we had really solid data about it, what we'd have is really solid data about the average response.
Yeah.
And so it's still going to come down to like, to the extent we have data, you should use that to use the highest probability outcome for you, and you still have to adjust it for yourself. As I said before, I do think that like you start thinking about red light after you've optimized your sun exposure.
Yeah.
And so I personally don't do that much red light because I feel like, I don't know. I don't feel like when I do it that I get that much benefit from it. I actually feel like I get more benefit from doing far infrared. And I think the reason is that, so my theory, and this is, some people will say that I'm, it's a little wooey or whatever, but I think that fire completes the infrared spectrum of the sun. Mm-hmm. And I think that for all of human history until very recently, we had a lot of exposure to sun and fire because the campfire was how you warmed up. It was how you cooked your food. Mm-hmm. It was something you gathered around. And so far infrared is a wood fire produces a lot of far infrared. The sun does not produce much. It mostly produces near infrared. And so I think that I perceive for myself, and I don't have highly quantified data on this, I just feel like 5 to 7 minutes in a far infrared sauna, completely independent of any heat effect of making me sweat, seems to increase my vitality. It's a vague way of saying it, but I've had it for years, and I continue to think that. And at the end of the day, it's not much of a cost to jump into the far infrared sauna for 5 to 7 minutes a day. So that's what I do.
Yeah. You only do 5 to 7 minutes in the sauna.
Yeah. And I I think part of the reason that I don't notice a similar benefit of red light is that I already do what I told you I do in the sun. Like I spend probably an hour in the morning sunlight each day. I spend about 40 minutes in the afternoon working outside in the sunlight. I'll wear a sun hat or I'll go under an umbrella so that I'm not getting it directly on my face. But that's delivering plenty of near infrared and red light. And then the whole rest of my day is I design my day to be as much as possible, not have to turn on any artificial lights. And so I'm getting a lot of the ideal composition of light for most of the day. I think that's why I don't personally feel like I get the red light benefit. But I do think that a lot of people, even if they did that, they would benefit from a lot of red light because it, because they have idiosyncratic deficits in their mitochondrial function that it's helping to fix.
Yeah.
And I've, other than getting burned, I've rarely heard of anyone who claimed that they got adverse effects from red light, but I have heard that from at least one person. And I think that's because there's a number of things that red light does in the mitochondria. One of them is it impacts the water viscosity in a way that makes everything work better across the board. And that's a very non-specific, good for your mitochondria effect. But there also are like specific complexes of the respiratory chain, which are the mitochondrial energy producing engines that take in red light. And I think that the rare person who's saying that their health got worse when they went above a certain dose of red light is, and to be clear, like anyone can get like burned if it's too close for too long, or they can get, mess with their eyes if it's going into their eyes too much. But I mean, someone actually saying like, the more I cumulatively used the red light, my health got worse. I think that's rare. And I think that's driven by defects in the mitochondria where it's just like if you're megadosing thiamine and you could run into a traffic jam because, you increase the supply of energy into a place where there's some other limiting bottleneck and then boom, everything crashes together. I think the same thing can be true of the red light where it's like, it's inputting in over here, but there's a block over here and then boom, you got a traffic jam.
Yeah. Well, for me personally, because exactly what you're talking about, and you can explain it better than I can, but those receptors that we have that are receiving the light, I think because a lot of other areas in my life are already kind of optimized. I take a walk around my neighborhood with my husband as soon as the light comes up, and it's about 30 minutes every morning. So I do a lot of that type of stuff. So I'm only doing red light 3 to 4 times per week maximum, because from what I kind of understood was you can also, it's not that it's going to hurt me, but it could just also be a waste of time potentially to be doing more
For sure. Yeah.
than, necessary. Because if those receptors are full, and it also, I believe, takes some time for the body to actually kind of like uptake that light and do something with it. Is that correct?
Well, there are people who are pursuing that idea in the research. I don't know that anyone can say with any authority on exactly what is going on there, but there was a study that came out earlier in the year where they blasted red light into people's chest, and they covered their eyes to make sure none of it went to their eyes, and they should improve their vision the next day.
Interesting.
So there is something like that, but I don't know that anyone can really say what it is. I think it's just you're improving mitochondrial function in certain hubs of the body that are responsible for the rest of the body's health. So your liver, for example, is incredibly important to the function of all your other organs because it's coordinating the energy distribution. If it were not for your liver, your brain would be kaput. And so I think that it's probably something along the lines of the red light is improving liver mitochondrial function. That's improving the supply of energy to the whole rest of your body for the whole rest of however long that effect lasts. And, maybe you see the max benefit at 24 hours. But I don't think this is something you might want to look at if you're doing a randomized crossover study on yourself. But I think most people are not going to do that and are much better off looking at long-term effects over time, it's way more informative to see what's happening to the red light has also been shown to improve glucose metabolism in one session as well. It's way more informative to see like what is the 4 to 6 week impact on my average morning glucose than it is to say like what happened to my glucose right after the session versus the next morning versus 24 hours later. I think if you're not trying to organize the logistics of a randomized study on yourself, most of those questions are a little too into the weeds on details, and what you really want to be focused, because I see a lot of people who, like they take a supplement or they eat a meal and then they test their blood sugar right after, and then they're making a conclusion about like, should I take that every day or not? No, actually the conclusion about whether you should take it every day or not is the long-term effect on the average. And I think most people would benefit a lot from thinking more about that.
Yeah. There's some interesting, have you seen any of the research around infertility and red light therapy?
I haven't done a deep dive into it, but what does it show?
Well, there's some interesting information. They're actually using like a proximal technique with this red light laser. And it's actually having a systemic benefit on, these women in Japan that were infertile. And, it had a pretty, I don't know the exact number off the top of my head, but it had a pretty substantial positive outcome in these women actually getting pregnant, because it seemed as if the mechanism of just applying it, not even to the ovaries, which is where I would think you would apply it, just to the neck, actually somehow systemically reduced inflammation in the ovaries.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So now, what is their hypothesis about the neck? Is it the thyroid?
I think it's actually more so like the large blood vessels, I suppose, maybe transporting it. Yeah, you should look into that, because infertility is like a massive issue right now, and women and men are struggling. It's a 2-person contributing outcome, but yeah, I think if something as simple as that, obviously the ideal would be, right, like go get the morning sun and change so many aspects of your lifestyle. But I'm excited to see where that research specifically goes.
Yeah, sounds really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, red light. We did mention sauna. So what do you think about the heat component of a sauna for mitochondrial health, or the detoxification benefits? Because I have to assume, I mentioned I do this, total toxic burden testing, and I've seen thousands of these tests over the course of running a clinic for, 5-6 years. Everybody came in thinking they were going to have a low toxic burden. They're like, I'm super healthy. Everything is really clean. Like everything's good. No one had a good toxic burden, like relative. Super rare. So I can't imagine all these toxic burdens. And when I say toxin, that's obviously a very broad statement, but this looks at molds and mycotoxins, environmental toxins, things like BPA and PFAS, and parabens and phthalates. And then we also look at heavy metals. So I can't imagine that these clearly increasing levels of toxic burdens are good for our mitochondria.
And have you seen that change with sauna?
Oh, 100%. So when I do a consistent sauna practice, I maintain...
For yourself or for all these people?
For myself. Okay. Well, in general, sauna was part of the protocol, and we would see people we had a bit more of aggressive protocols that we would do. So we'd actually put them in an ozone sauna, depending on their levels. And we saw significant decreases in those toxins in a relatively short period of time. For me, when I maintain a standard sauna practice 4 to 7 times per week at about 25 to 35-minute intervals, my toxins are always the lowest, even if I have some exposures from whatever it may be, travel, etc. So I'm interested to hear what you think about that.
Well, that's interesting. It makes a lot of sense because you do sweat out a lot of toxins. It'd be interesting to try to, I guess, it would be very interesting to try to tease out what is the mechanism of the apparent longevity effect. How much is it dependent on the toxins versus how much is it dependent on the heat shock protein adaptive response? I think that there's probably, promoting detoxification is probably a universal thing. Needing some boost to the detoxification is probably a pretty universal thing. It'd be interesting to compare that to other methods of detox, because there are supplements, for example, that are meant to improve detoxification. Mm-hmm. if you're taking those, does what you lose in your urine equal what you lose in the sweat during a sauna? It'd be interesting to compare those different approaches. I'm not sure how they would stack up.
Yeah.
I do think that the heat is, I think there's one very interesting thing about sauna is that sauna is a great way to reduce your body heat. And the principal adaptation of regular sauna use is a decrease in your core body temperature.
Yeah.
And that's because you, rather than lowering your heat production, you're improving your heat elimination. So that would allow you to maintain robust cellular energy production with a lot of heat production, but remove the heat from your body more effectively and maintain a lower core body temperature. The reason that I think that's interesting is that there are a lot of genetic defects whose defect is that the protein is what they call thermolabile, which means that it's so any protein, if you heat it enough, will denature. And that's why if you cook meat or you cook anything, you get something that looks a lot different than when it was raw, because the proteins are unraveling and they're interacting with the water and they're creating kind of a new overall structure. And if we denatured all of the proteins in our body, we of course would die because we'd cook ourselves. But the thermolabile enzymes are enzymes that are denatured by body heat, that they're so sensitive to heat that body heat is too high for them. And there are actually some very common polymorphisms that fall into that category. One is MTHFR, the C677T, which is the bad one. That is a thermolabile gene that causes the enzyme to denature enough by body heat alone that it loses its riboflavin cofactor. Riboflavin is vitamin B2, and it's necessary for the MTHFR enzyme. And the studies show that you can actually normalize that MTHFR polymorphism by doubling riboflavin intake from 1.3 milligrams to from 1.6 milligrams to 3.2 milligrams per day. There's another one, tyrosinase, which is, there's a very common polymorphism that plays a major role in hair graying. I have it.
Okay.
And that makes body heat denature the protein enough that it loses its copper cofactor. And I have a hypothesis. So I've thought a lot about whether sauna is going to make this worse or better. And so I did a lot of research onto the time course at which body heat changes after sauna. And although your body heat goes up a lot during the sauna, and theoretically you could make one of those enzymes function worse temporarily, the more sauna you do and the higher temperature you do it at, the lower your core body temperature over time. In fact, some of the most extreme sauna protocols can get a 1 degree Celsius, so almost more than double that Fahrenheit, decrease in core body temperature permanently while you're doing the protocol. I think that one of the unappreciated benefits of that might be that a lot of people have thermolabile enzymes, that many of them are mitochondrial enzymes that are, involved in your mitochondrial energy production, where that's actually the core benefit isn't the heat shock protein response. Maybe it's detoxifying, but the idiosyncratic benefit for that person is that they've cut their body temperature down by maybe a quarter or half a degree, depending on the intensity of the protocol. And now those mitochondrial enzymes just work a little bit better because they don't have the burden of their heat removal process is a little better. But all those things need more. One thing that's clear is that sauna use is tied to longevity. Why, how, and how to individualize that to different people. I think we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I mean, from what I've seen, obviously we have a ton of tech in this house, but like the one thing that I would definitely want to keep is sauna for all of the plethora of longevity benefits and heart health benefits, brain benefits, possibly. So love that. Okay. What about cold therapy and mitochondrial health?
I think cold therapy is something that you don't want to do if you're trying to build muscle. Don't do it after your hypertrophy workout. That's one thing that we know.
Yeah.
I think that cold is a way of, just as exercise is a way of directing where energy goes, cold therapy is mostly a way of directing when energy goes.
Okay.
So if you're jumping into a cold tank for 2 minutes, I think what you're doing is you're pulling forward the energy budget for the day into certain systems that are going to be hyperactivated in your brain over the course of those 2 minutes, and then other systems that are going to be moderately stimulated for maybe the rest of the workday. And I've talked to people who did it every day. I had a friend who did 6 minutes of cold therapy every day, and the tank was very cold, but I forgot what the temperature was. And when he first started doing it, he told me, every time I have a problem I need to solve, I just meditate on the problem and I jump in the cold tank for 6 minutes. And by the time I get out, I've solved the problem.
Wow.
But 6 months later, I talked to him about it, and he said, yeah, I've reduced my dose a bit. I do it a few times a month now. And I think what that's showing is that it's on a time scale basis, he's using a stimulus to move the diffuse energy that could have been, spent on anything for 24 hours. And he's hyper focusing it into his problem solving area of his brain for 6 minutes. And then maybe for 6 hours, he feels better. He feels more awake, more alert. And then maybe that also has the benefit of better sleep, because, when your energy is distributed in a better structure over time, that is what happens. You're more alert during the day and you sleep more restfully at night. But if you are excessively driving the energy into the 6 minutes of problem solving, now you're actually on a long-term level, you're accumulating quite a bit of debt. And you don't notice it after the first 6 minutes, but you do that for 6 months. You've got a lot of 6-minute periods where you've taken a whole day's worth of problem solving energy and you put it into there, and you might have solved 360 problems. But now you need a little bit more rest. And so I think that's the right way to think about that. I don't have a cold tank in my house, but if I had one, what I would do is I would use it in cycles. So I'd do what I've found over many years is that I operate best if I work without stopping, except to sleep mainly, for 4 or 5 weeks. I skip my weekends, and then I take off all the weekends I owe myself in one big batch. And I find that allows me to get into deep work much better than on a 5-day-a-week cycle. And then also the rest periods are much more rewarding. So in that context, I would use 2 minutes of cold therapy to start my workday, to leverage on the daily scale, immediately enriching my kind of jump starting my workday. And then on the monthly scale, I'm kind of drawing energy from my rest periods and infusing it into that batch. And then I would take 8 days off and I wouldn't do any cold therapy. And I would, completely refocus my energies where I'm recharging all those systems. And I think that's a great way to use it to temporarily restructure when the energy is spent, knowing that you feel better because you borrowed energy from a different time. And at some point you have to pay it back. Otherwise it's just like going pedal to the metal, 10 out of 10 hard on your workout every single day and never taking a day off. That doesn't work either.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. I sometimes like to use cold therapy prior to a workout because there have been some studies. They actually like had athletes put these cold mitts on during their workout and they got, substantially more reps. So by just obviously cooling the core body temperature prior to doing a workout, potentially having better endurance.
No, that makes sense. Yeah. But I also think that all those things I don't think you always want to use your max pre-workout.
Yeah.
Just in general, right? Like, because sometimes it depends exactly what you're trying to do as well. Like I think you could argue for hypertrophy that if you can maximize like what the intensity of what you're doing in that moment, that's particularly beneficial. But if you're specifically trying to train performance or strength, then I think you don't always want to be resting on a crutch.
Yeah.
Like if anything, what you want to be doing, if you're really serious about it, you would occasionally train in a sleep deprived state. Not just not always have the pre-workout crutch, but even put the extra stress, especially if you're a competitive athlete. So I just think you have to be smart about it. Like that's another example where it's like you are borrowing from somewhere else the ability to work out harder in that instant. You want to be strategic about that and not just think like, oh, the more reps or the more weight I hit, it's always better. What's always better is that you become stronger and more adaptable and more resilient, and your strength becomes more resilient over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And yeah, I definitely do a lot of cycling around that, even sometimes within like the 20 to 30 day cycle that I have as a woman. And then also just taking some months completely off. So
No, makes total sense.
yeah. What we haven't really touched on much is, clearing out bad mitochondria. Do any of these hormetic stressors that we've spoken about, how can we like help our bodies clear out the bad ones, if this is even possible?
Yeah. So one thing that in the Mitome protocols we recommend to almost everyone as a potential other thing that they could do for their mitochondria besides what they're individually given is this concept of a fasting feeding reset. And it is essentially a concept very similar to what we were talking about before when we were talking about going through the fasting feeding cycle. And the protocol version reflects my agnosticism on exactly what the appropriate fasting structure should be. And so it kind of guides you through, you could pick from among these different fasting protocols, but here are some supplements you could take to accentuate that fasting phase. Here are some supplements you could take to accentuate the feeding phase. And one of those supplements would be urolithin A, which is a microbiome byproduct of ellagic acid, which is highest in pomegranates. And you can buy it as a supplement. Although you could probably get a similar effect by drinking like a pint and a half of pomegranate juice, just with the sugar load.
I heard that the white part of the pomegranate does it have a good amount in there too to like throw it in a smoothie?
I'm not sure what the distribution is off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. Yeah. But that's an example of a supplement that has been shown to increase the turnover of the mitochondria. And going through the cycle of degrading the bad mitochondria and rebuilding up new good mitochondria, that's like kind of the essence of what should happen across a fasting feeding cycle. Although there's a lot of mythology about autophagy. Mitophagy is the mitochondrial subtype of autophagy. Autophagy is the cell breaks down itself. Mitophagy is the old bad mitochondria get broken down. It's people think that it's stimulated by fasting, and to some extent it is, but in muscle protein, there are some studies that suggest that exercising and eating protein is how you get optimal autophagy. And
interesting.
And, this comes back to what the emphasis that I've been trying to put on throughout this episode, which is you always want to keep your mind on the core real human outcomes as you're thinking about the mechanisms and how they play out. So you want to be thinking about for every health issue, you should think about your mitochondria first, because your mitochondrial energy production is what's going to drive the health outcome. But you still want to say, like, okay, practically, what do we do about that? What's the best metric that it's succeeding? And the best metric that it's succeeding is that your health is improving, not that you're theorizing that there's more mitochondria.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting about that is you could have gotten tied up in the autophagy theory that ran away with the fasting thing. And then you'd forget that what do you need? Why do you get hypertrophy from muscle building? It's not because you're signaling the muscle to be bigger. It's because you're signaling the muscle to adapt to the stress that you put on it. Mm-hmm. What your body's trying to do isn't get smaller or bigger muscles. It's trying to get muscles that are better able to do the thing you were trying to make it do, right? Yeah. And so that means that the muscle has to remodel. Mm-hmm. And you have to have autophagy for any kind of remodeling. Your bones, for example, your bones they don't just get denser or less dense or bigger or smaller. Mm-hmm. You exercise in a certain way, you're going to build your bones up in a certain way, and your bones have to break down bone tissue and build it back up to make that remodeling happen. And so I think that's why the bro science workout and eat protein thing drives autophagy and skeletal muscle, because that's what allows, that's the signal that's what we know allows the remodeling of the muscle. But anyway, nevertheless, like on a whole body systemic level, mitochondrial regeneration through a fasting feeding reset with certain accentuators that's I think where to go in terms of just the main way that you think about mitochondrial turnover.
And so I'm taking a urolithin supplement pretty much all the time. Do you recommend also cycling that with the fasting window, it sounded like?
From the human studies, I would not go more than 12 weeks. Okay. And I say that not because we have data showing that it becomes harmful after 12 weeks, mm-hmm. but I could give you many examples of things that are mostly tested for 8 to 12 weeks and are consistently good in that time frame and bad on a long time frame. So one that's been studied a lot is fish oil. The 8 to 12 week studies consistently show that high dose fish oil is very effective against depression over 8 to 12 weeks. But the two studies that have been done on fish oil for 4 to 5 years showed 15% increase in depression. Cardiovascular disease, tons of studies showing that 1 to 2 years of fish oil is good for your heart. The only study that's ever been done more than 4 years showed 30% increase in heart disease. SSRIs, all the doctors prescribe them based on 8 to 12 week studies that show that you can get off them pretty easily. No one studied them for 5 years. The average person's put on them for 5 years. And the observational studies looking at people trying to go off them after they've been on for 1 year show that it's pretty hard. 2 years, it's a lot harder. 5 years, it's catastrophically hard. 8 years, it's a whole other story. Similarly, for depression, vitamin D trials are the ones that are 12 weeks or shorter look a lot better than the ones that are 12 weeks or longer. I'm sure if you were optimizing against blood work, you'd be able to solidify that long term. But there's just so many examples of things that turn out to be bad when used longer than what they were studied for, that urolithin A has only been studied for 12 weeks. So to me, 12 weeks at a time is a good idea to get the benefits that were shown in that study. The reason that I particularly would single that out, not single it out, but why I would highlight it as something that should probably be cycled is because of its mechanism of action. So it seems to be a hormetic stressor. hormetic means a little bit of something bad is good for you by causing an adaptive response to it. And if you look at studies in animals, it looks like it is indirectly signaling mitochondrial biogenesis by degrading the mitochondria. And so what you see is an early phase drop in mitochondrial function that then gets replaced by a benefit after that. But if the primary mechanism is in stimulating so the way to think about this is, if someone doesn't have good mitochondrial turnover, they might want to jumpstart the process of degrading the mitochondria, because that will then start the process and they can finish it through mitochondrial biogenesis.
Yeah.
But there's still this lingering question of, if you're taking the thing that's going to break the mitochondria down, what happens if you maximize that signal for 6, 12 months, 2 years, 4 years? I have no idea. Yeah. So I'm not saying that it's not good to take indefinitely. I'm just saying I wouldn't take it indefinitely. I would take a more literal interpretation of the trials in that case, because I have this just open question of, am I going to wind up with too few mitochondria if I'm supplementing something that's stimulating mitophagy and it's out of balance with my mitochondrial biogenesis capacity?
Yeah.
I don't know. So that's how I think about that.
So what would be the cycle off time period? Like 3 months, 6 months, a year?
Well, there are no cycling studies, so by default I would say 12-week cycle, 12 weeks on, 12 weeks off.
Okay. Well, good. You might have just saved me from having too little mitochondria in the future. Goodness.
Yeah.
Can't have that. Okay, great. I mean, I think we pretty much covered the gamut of things definitely people should be doing, things people could be doing. We talked about some exogenous molecules. Is there anything else that you would put into that bucket before we talk about some sex differences of mitochondria?
No, I mean, the list of supplements that we could talk about is endless, but I think the core ones that everyone should be thinking about, we covered.
Okay. All right, great. Well, as we mentioned, or I mentioned, and we talked about, a lot of my audience is female. One of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is this higher mitochondrial density in the ovaries, because in my brain, I'm like, how can we possibly extend ovarian longevity, right? If we could do that, it would be such a game changer for all women. We know the risk of all-cause mortality and dementia and cancer and cardiovascular disease, etc., increases substantially with the loss of estrogen and perimenopause and menopause. So, what do we know about any sex differences from males to females with mitochondria? And then maybe also life stages. Like, I would have to assume that when you're creating a human life, there's this stress on your mitochondria. Is there anything that we could potentially do in addition to the strategies that we already talked about during some different life phases for women?
I think it's almost certain that the more we study this, the more we're going to find that the answer is yes, and we're going to figure out what the specific types of differences are. But at the moment, there is not there is no oocyte mitochondrial density in males. Yes. So there are some very stark sex differences. But to what extent can you use a different tissue that both males and females have, like a buccal swab or a blood cell extract or a biopsy, to see those? And I've looked at the data, and there is not a consistent quantitative way to scale a test that can be run on everyone at this time. But there are some indications that there is something different. And I can definitely say that the whole purpose of the dichotomy between male and female hormonal architecture is to impact mitochondrial function differently in different organs. So while we can't say, I mean, what I mean by there's no data, there's not enough quantitative data for a test, what I mean is we don't have the data to say, if we swab your cheek and isolate the mitochondria and look at the function of the complexes, we can't adjust the normal ranges to sex right now. We can't say for a woman, you're operating at 74%. We can only say for the average, you're operating at 74%. But if you look at, I mentioned male pattern baldness and its response to androgens before, you see this dichotomy where the androgens are sort of female hormones direct energy into different places than, female, male. Everyone has DHT and everyone has testosterone, but estrogen and testosterone are doing very different things in where they're directing the energy, although they both are directing the energy towards the respective reproductive organs in each sex. And so I think that in terms of the mitochondrial biology, you're going to see that there's a lot of differences like that, but it's more explaining the effects that you already know are there than it is telling you something new. So we already know that men put more energy into certain tissues than women do and vice versa. But anyway, so I think there's a lot to learn about that, but I don't think there's a lot to say right now about how those differences are. Although I do think that, the emerging evidence in fertility indicates that there's got to be a very mitochondrial function aspect to it, because if you look at some of the treatments, like, a lot of women are responding to CoQ10 as an example.
What do you think about, if you've looked into it a bit, SS31 for mitochondrial health?
Oh, I have looked into that. It was a bad idea from the start because it was a biohack that's not based on nature. So almost every biohacking device that you've talked about, that you've brought up in this conversation, has been something that replicates nature. So my far infrared replicates the ancient ancestral campfire. The red light box replicates the sun. The near infrared replicates the sun. The PEMF pad replicates the frequency of the earth. Now you get to SS31 and you've got a peptide that it wasn't even synthesized to mimic what the mitochondria does. It was synthesized by someone who had in their own head this bright idea that if they used their knowledge of chemistry, they could direct antioxidant power into the mitochondria. So the first phase 3 trial, now you can say all kinds of things of like, oh, it looked promising in this animal study and etc. But the largest study to date just came out. And what it showed was that it did nothing that was beneficial, but it doubled the risk of all the side effects. And it wasn't just injection site side effects. It was like people had more headaches. They had more, just whatever it was, they had twice of it. And to me, I'm like, well, that's not surprising, because that's what happens when you prize your own brain above the natural world. So I do think that a lot of people would accuse me of using the appeal to nature fallacy, although what I'm actually doing is I'm analyzing the phase 3 trial results of the peptide. But I think a lot of people confuse the appeal to nature is a fallacy. If you're appealing to nature as a way to form a conclusion that it's something that is natural, therefore it has to be better than something that's not natural. And that's obviously not the case, because poison ivy is I'd rather eat some ultra processed foods than eat poison ivy. And if you eat the wrong mushroom, you're going to die, right? So there's things in nature that'll kill you. But it's not a fallacy to say that the human body is way more complex than we are able to comprehend, that there's way more about it that we don't know than that we do know, and that will probably never change. And so if you're looking at something like the cell gym, you're taking a stress that your body has already had to handle because exercise is a form of relative hypoxia. Humans have been traveling into the mountains for eons. So our body knows how to respond to hypoxia. Now, I can tell you right now what I think the molecular signatures of the hypoxia response are. There are a couple hundred that are in the literature. But to think that I know what the hypoxia response is in its essence, because I've read the current state of the literature, is to be full of hubris and arrogance. What I know is that I don't know everything about the hypoxia response. So rather than, I could inject cobalt chloride into my brainstem, and I know that it's going to activate the hypoxia response in one of the tissues that I decided based on the literature is a main responder to hypoxia. But am I going to be better off than if I was using the cell gym? I doubt it, because the cell gym says, we don't have to know what your body's going to do in response to this. We're just going to provide a way of accentuating the natural stress. So you are embracing technology, but you're taking the inspiration from the technology from nature.
Yeah.
And then you're allowing your body in its natural capacity to respond to the stress through a symphony of thousands of mechanisms that you may understand anywhere between 20% and 0.00002% of. So I don't think it's an appeal to nature fallacy to say SS31 was probably a bad idea because it didn't take enough inspiration from nature. It would be appeal to nature fallacy for me to ignore the trial results, but I look at the trial results and I'm like, I'm not surprised. So I don't think there's any current application of SS31. I will say that the trial results did subgroup analyses that said maybe it might have helped a little bit for people with certain types of DNA defects. But one of the things that you learn if you study the principles of evidence-based medicine is that subgroup analyses from randomized trials are usually wrong, because they're just observational studies where you came up with an idea, you mined the data until you found something that was good, that you could say good about your drug. So maybe future studies will say that for specific people, SS31 is a good treatment. But right now, I would say there's no one who's a good candidate for SS31 treatment. And that's a bit different than a lot of other peptides that people are taking. I mean, even the GLP-1s are just all they're doing. They took the inspiration from nature. They said, when you eat a meal and you don't want to eat more, what are the things that make you not want to eat more? And then they synthesize those things and they inject them into people. I'm not going to do it for myself, but that's a lot smarter than saying, oh, like these structures look like they could be good antioxidants. Maybe I should put 2 of them together here, and then I can add these 7 amino acids to it and it'll go to the mitochondria. Like that, GLP-1s work so well, not that they don't have any downsides, but they definitely work. Yeah. And the reason they work is because people were taking their inspiration primarily from nature, and saying like, there's a little bit of arrogance in it, in that it's saying, but not everyone who's arrogant is wrong. Yeah. And so far they work.
They definitely do. Again, I'm not something that I'm using, but obviously I've seen almost every guest I have on brings up GLP-1s. It's like wild.
I didn't come here intending to bring them up, but I guess the reason I bring them up is to contrast them with SS31, where it's like, even the GLP-1s are things that I wouldn't touch them with a 14-foot pole. But the good thing I can say about them is that unlike SS31, they did take their inspiration from nature. So I do think it's a good example of how you can be like very biotech, pharma forward, and you can still acknowledge the importance of taking inspiration from nature.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like GLP-1s were necessary, I guess, because our state of obesity and chronic disease in general is like it's crazy because I don't see it a lot like in my normal life, but we see the statistics. It's wild. Do you think that there'll have to be some sort of like GLP-1 like intervention to save people's mitochondria if they can't figure out how to master the basics?
No. So I would say a couple of things about that. So first of all, that's very convenient to industry that no one could find a way for people to not be obese until they came up with really expensive drugs. Um, and they're going to get more expensive because each new edition or each new variant that they make. So retatrutide is and there are people buying it on the gray market now, but when it comes out, it'll probably be a lot more expensive than the earlier ones because it's more effective. But anyway, and it does cost more to produce it, but mainly because it's more effective. That's kind of glossing over like, why can we not find a way for people to not be obese, which is that we've created an environment that is profitable to other industries that don't want anything to change, right? So we do know that people are obese because they eat the food that's in the store. And, if you were to intervene in that, it would require either education that massively changes people's consumer habits, or it would require intervening in school lunches. It would require intervening in, there are other things too, like physical activity is lower because up until very recently, all of the buildings in America were built with the elevator in the center and the stairs far off on the sides, under the idea that no one would want to use the stairs and they would all use the elevator, but that made no one use the stairs and everyone used the elevator. So there's lots of things in society that play a role in that. But I think that the science is pretty clear about how to lose weight. And so I don't think that highly motivated people need to be on GLP-1s to achieve weight loss. I think that people that don't have the education, don't have the knowledge, and don't have the motivation need GLP-1s for weight loss. I do think that there is, so if you talk to the people who use them, one of the most unanimous things that they say is that what it does is it decreases their the food noise. Yeah. And so what that indicates is that it is decreasing the reward value of the food. And the reward value is basically the degree to which the food is addictive because it's stimulating the pleasure centers in your brain. And that goes back to the whole theory of obesity based on hyperpalatable foods. So the food industry, basically the tobacco industry went underground and popped up as the new food industry. And then they took all the things that they did to the cigarettes to try to make you smoke more of them, and they did it to make you eat more chips and more Oreos. Yeah. And so all those things are basically, so you've got the tobacco turned food industry feeding you anti-GLP-1s. And then pharma comes out with the cure, which is the GLP-1s. Like, so to look at that and to look at that without a conspiratorial lens is to be a fool. It's not, I'm not saying that like someone in Nabisco paid off someone to come out with the GLP. I'm not saying it's a direct connection. I'm not saying it's that level of conspiracy. I'm saying just very clearly, there's people making a massive amount of profit on having invented the anti-GLP-1s to make you fat. And then now someone else comes along and makes a massive amount of profit giving you the GLP-1s to counteract the anti-GLP-1s in the junk food that you were eating. It's just, if you were trying to rationally construct society, you would not do it like this. Let's say that. And so I think that, on a society level, are we going to see already 12% of people are already on them. So I don't like, is that going to go to 30%? I hope not, but it wouldn't surprise me. But I do think that like, if nothing gets done, I think part of this will be, how does the political Maha landscape play out over the next year? Because there's a lot of people that are trying to leverage political energy to make real changes in school lunches, to find real ways to decrease ultra-processed food consumption. And I think those are the things that are necessary to have a non-pharmacological resolution of the obesity epidemic. And I think that a lot of people get lost in the fact that the proximate, meaning the closest to the direct cause of weight loss is a calorie deficit. And that's true. But the question is, why does everyone's weight go back up? And I believe it's very straightforwardly because the hyperpalatable foods that people eat mess with the set point in the brain and say that you belong at 150 pounds when they should be saying you belong at 120 pounds. And so people do a weight loss diet and they're cutting out those foods. And yes, they induced a calorie deficit, but the real active component was, in order to get the calorie deficit, they cut out the foods that were telling their brain they had to be 30 pounds fatter. So they go down and then they say, oh, now I've lost my weight. Now I can eat those other foods again. I just won't eat so many of them that I'll regain all the weight. But then they go back to those foods and it messes with their brain again. And then they start going back up to the set point that those hyperpalatable foods are saying. So unfortunately, people are going to have to, not eat whatever they want. And some people won't do that. And they're going to have to go on a GLP-1 to lose weight.
Well, unfortunately, it looks like most people won't do that. Like that's what I feel like the stats say.
Well, most people aren't going to do that if you just tell people what to do, right? But if you make real changes in the organized structure of society. So one of the things and Stephan Guyenet had a great book called The Hungry Brain that went way into the details of how the brain regulates your body fatness. And one of the things that it does is it calculates the effort needed to get the food as part of whether it wants to eat more of that, right? Like, so you eat more Oreos and the brain says, okay, I'm going to eat 200 more total calories a day to get my Oreos. But then you put the Oreos on the table, or you put the Oreos in the desk drawer, or you put the other Oreos in the other room, or you put the Oreos down the hall.
Or you never buy Oreos.
And you... Well, right. But I'm saying experimentally in an office setting, just having the Oreos further away decreases the Oreo consumption, even though having the Oreos in the diet makes the total calories go up. Right.
Yeah.
So if it's like, it's like, I don't want to get sued by the Oreos, but so any of these hyperpalatable junk foods, right? Pick your example. Say you decide to eat them. So now you're going to eat 200 more calories because you've messed with the set point in your brain that said you're supposed to be eating 2,700, not 2,500. Now you make them a little harder to get by putting them in the other room. Now you dock that by 30 calories, right? Now your brain is saying, well, I would have you eat 2,700 if it wasn't so hard to get them. But now I'm going to recalculate how many Oreos you should eat. And I'm going to put you at 2670. They're not in the building. I'm going to put you at 2630, right? So a lot of people spend a lot of time in school or at work, etc. And if you can make institutional changes where, let's say, the corporation says it's part of our corporate philosophy that, like, it's in our mission statement that we want to maximize the health of our employees. And so therefore, we're not going to have vending machines on this campus and people can bring whatever they want to work, but we're going to make the healthiest foods available for the lunch. Things like that would probably make a meaningful impact on this because, if you just tell people to use their willpower, they're going to be like, I used my willpower on 70 other things today. I don't have any left over. Sorry. But if you modify the environment that people are in a way that doesn't fundamentally, you're not banning junk food. You're just saying, we're not going to, as an institution, we're not going to make it so easy for you to be fat.
Yeah.
Then I think you can have society-wide policies or institution. There can be a societal-wide effort for individual institutions to enact policies that do not infringe on human freedom, but still are more consistent with making the environment favorable for people to do what's right for their health instead of making it too easy to do what's wrong. And I think you would see real impacts of that.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. I have no intentions on ever running for president, but everyone better hope that I never become it, because no junk food whatsoever, mandatory exercise, I mean, this is just right. Like, health is such a beautiful thing for people to have. And it's so sad that we have normalized poor health to the point that everyone believes it's common and it's like overlooked. Like, all these things are just normal now. And that's so sad to me.
2028.
Yeah.
Voting for you.
No, I have no interest, but I mean,
right, Kayla?
Yeah. So, well, this has been such a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Well, we'll make sure to include all the show notes, all of your links. Also, you mentioned a couple of really interesting like downloads and things that people can use. So we'll make sure to include all of that.
Cool.
So thanks so much for being on.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely.